Today is Friday, June 10, 2016. I'm interviewing Dr. Ann M. Bartuska, Deputy Undersecretary for the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Research, Education, and Economics Mission Area. I am Susan Fugate, Head of Special Collections at the National Agricultural Library. I've been an employee of the U.S. Department of Agriculture for almost 40 years. We are in the studios of the Creative Media and Broadcast Center in Washington, D.C. Please state your full name and spell it.
Ann, A-N-N, M. Bartuska, B as in boy, A-R-T-U-S-K-A.
Okay, let's begin with some biographical information. Please provide some details of your biographical information, going back as far as you'd like.
Well, I really do have to start where I was born and raised, which is in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And the reason I say that is as an urban kid, I learned about nature through growing up there, and it's surprising how you can better understand ecosystems, which is why I ended up in ecosystems. So born and raised in Philadelphia, third and fourth generation American from the central part of Europe, Polish and Lithuanian, and a very strong family. One of six, actually the oldest of six girls, all of whom went to college and all of whom attained professional responsibilities. And then I got into pretty much continuous education from kindergarten through my Ph.D., and I never took a break. So it seemed like a very long time before I finished that.
So you talked about the influence of where you grew up. Can you talk about some other influences that guided your choices in education, your research interests, and your career?
You know, the thing that's really interesting, I mentioned growing and being born and raised in Philadelphia. Part of the reason I got interested in nature is because my mother, who is a physician, always took us on walks and told us about what we were seeing, the nature that we see. She loved plants, and so she would always tell us the scientific name of plants as well as the common name. And she got that from her father, who really had the Polish gene of growing fresh vegetables in the backyard no matter where we were. And so there's a very deep connection to nature that I grew up with from my mother's side. But then on my father's side, both of my parents were born and raised in a small town called Nanticoke, Pennsylvania, in upstate PA, which is the anthracite coal mining area. And my grandfather, Bartuska, was a coal miner. Actually, he was a foreman. But right out the back door of his house, his and my grandmother's house, was what we call a comb bank. It's the waste of anthracite mining. And so you have this incredible moon-like landscape out the back. But you also had trees growing on it. And I just remember being very little trying to figure out why you had these absolutely gorgeous white birches growing on, which I discovered were white birches, growing on this really hot, which I later found out was very acidic substrate. So both the urban walking around, learning about nature, and then seeing this in real time really triggered my interest in biology. I knew I wanted to go into science probably from 5th grade, when I got my first archaeology kit. But I ended up being an ecosystem ecologist because of some really great professors when I finally went to college. And I ended up at Wilkes College in Pennsylvania, which is in that same general area where my parents grew up.
In your social media, you give a special thank you to several of the professors from Wilkes College. And I'd like you to identify who they are and talk about how they influenced you throughout your education and your career.
Well, the first one I have to mention is Dr. Charles Rife, or Chuck as he goes by, and he's interesting in that he was one of the earlier biology professors, and he actually taught my mother in 1949 because she went to Wilkes when it was called Bucknell Jr., and he remembered her. He was a brand new faculty member, but he remembered her a lot because she just was fascinated by science, and he's the one who encouraged her to go into medicine. So when I went back to the same college and met him, I saw that he had incredible knowledge and really spurred me, challenged all of us actually to learn. So Chuck Rife, Dr. Rife was certainly one of those important people, and just guiding my overall biology interest. And then probably the person who stimulated my interest in ecology was Skip Halsneck. I did not know about ecology, actually, before I went to college. I knew biology. I knew I wasn't going to be pre-med, or I wasn't going to be go to medical school. I wasn't pre-med. But I wasn't quite sure what area I would really focus on. And I took ecology as one of my many credits that I needed in biology. And he just brought ecology to life, but in particular demonstrated that ecology is the science where it connects everything. So it connects the water and the soil and the air and the biology and people. And that just really triggered my interest in ecology, which eventually became an ecosystem focused, because I just really liked looking at the scale of ecosystems rather than going down into the minutia of a particular organism. And then the other was Les Tarosi, who just overall was a very accessible professor to many of us in my class when I was there, and really introduced us to a lot of different aspects of biology. It was a liberal arts college, which is one of the things that really I think has prepared me for my diverse career, which I think it has become very diverse. And he also was the one who got us, we went to the Galapagos for almost a month, and that was just an incredible experience to see, and before they had a whole lot of tourists, so it was really fairly early on. But those three just really helped in terms of shaping my interest in the sciences and my approach to science, and it really, I think, created a very solid foundation for me in the future.
Well, I think not many people make the effort to say those thank yous, and I think that's a wonderful
Thank you.
Can you tell us how you came to be appointed as the Deputy Undersecretary for REE?
Well, that is a very interesting question, and I have to go a little bit back in time. When we were going through the transition for the new administration, but this would have been right after the election, I was one of the people brought over from the Forest Service to talk about Forest Service programs. Basically, the Obama transition team was trying to figure out, what was existing within USDA. And I was deputy chief for research at the time, and of course they were interviewing all the deputy chiefs, which is basically head of research for the Forest Service. And in part of that, we were trying to explain the linkages between climate change and bioenergy and forest management. And so I drew this graphic, and I showed everybody around the transition table, and it showed the connections of how you could relate wildfire management, forest management, carbon cycle, climate change, and it was very informative to the group. Carol Jett actually was the person who was leading the team. And so then I went back to my job, and about a week or so later, they asked me to come back over and explain it to the next group of the transition team. So we ended up, it was a very comfortable discussion that I was having with those who were shaping the new administration. And then I went back to my job. I actually went off on executive leadership training. There's a great course called the Leadership for Collective Intelligence, where we go away for a week to Chatham, Mass, and just study like crazy. And I was in my class, and I got this phone call, and we're not supposed to use the cell phone. And so I just clicked it off, and then I got another one, and then it was the fifth one, and then I looked and saw it with the 720 exchange, which I knew was the secretary's office. And I said, I better take this call. And that's when I was offered to come back, and January, the first day of the new administration, serve as Acting Undersecretary for Natural Resources and Environment. So I started right off the bat in an acting capacity as a career, and I'm proud to say that I'm still a career senior executive for USDA. Spent 9 months in that job, went back to my deputy chief job, and then the acting undersecretary for REE had to leave, and they asked me to come back over and say, well, we know you. You know us. Would you be willing to serve as the acting undersecretary for REE until the new person, which became Kathy Wotecki, was appointed or went through confirmation, and I did that. And then they asked, after Kathy was settled in or was named, would you be willing to come back as her deputy undersecretary? And I thought about it, and I said, yeah, I'd like to do it. First, I did ask Dr. Witecki first if she wanted to have me, because all of the undersecretaries really need to create their own team. But we had gotten along very well in the introductory discussions that we were having and when I was briefing her. And it has turned out to be a really wonderful partnership, and we are 6 years, practically 6 years tomorrow, as a matter of fact, and going strong. And it's really been it was a surprise. It's not something I necessarily looked for, but it was a very important step for me.
Great story. Talk about some of the challenging issues that you've faced in REE particularly, and maybe illustrate your primary focus.
The interesting thing about REE, Research, Education, Economics, and one could say extension, is it provides the science and statistical basis for decision-making for the entire USDA. So, and I say that because it emphasizes how variable the job is and how many different subjects that we are dealing with at any given point in time. So we may be dealing with climate change at one day, food safety the next. Actually, usually it's the same day and maybe in the same morning. Pollinators, which we're doing a lot of, antimicrobial resistance. So I think one of the biggest challenges within the REE mission area itself is staying on top of this full suite of issues. But then the big challenge is, how do you introduce science that frequently is informing policy in a way that changes policy, and get those who are going to accept that science or statistical information to recognize that their policies may need to be changed based on that science. And that is, I think, only scientists really understand that our job is to challenge conventional wisdom. And so just because something has been established in statute doesn't necessarily mean it's right when new science informs that, in fact, there's a new direction we need to go. So as the scientific conscience of the department, which prides itself on being a science-based organization, which really makes it a very powerful organization, you're always challenging. And how you do that in a way that is not setting off fireworks or is creating animosities, but do it in a way that people recognize you're just trying to assist and inform and help make progress and to do the best job we can. And I think it really takes a lot of energy to do that in a way that is listened to. And I think we have been successful at doing that, but it takes a lot of effort to do that.
In recent years, you were chosen to lead the GeoGlam initiative for USDA. Can you tell us what that is and why it's important to the work of USDA and REE? And talk about your role in that.
Will do. Well, GeoGlam is the Global Earth Observation Global Ag Monitoring Project. And GEO itself is an international body that is actually, the Secretariat's in Geneva. And the GLAM, the Ag Monitoring piece, is one of the signature projects or initiatives within the overall geosphere. GeoGlam itself is designed to bring satellite imagery and other remote sense imagery into the monitoring of agricultural production, and it's matched by in situ measurements, so that if we're looking at the amount of yield and productivity of soybeans in Brazil, since it is a global effort, we actually have people also on the ground validating what you're seeing. Now, why I was brought into it, and frankly, why REE was brought into it, speaks to the evolution of science, and that's what the point I was making about what REE does. The initial components of GeoGlam, which were endorsed by the G20, were to focus on the main commodity crops globally, which are wheat, cotton, rice, corn, and soybean. And so it was very limited in scope, but in terms of agricultural markets, it's a very important piece. Where some of the members of the GEO community felt was a research need and a coordination need to look beyond those commodity crops and to start recognizing what other things we should be considering as we go forward into the future GeoGLAM, because it is an international global activity on agricultural production, but also to improve the metrics and our way of capturing yield and productivity. And so there's a research component to this that the geo community itself felt needed to be added, and appropriately they came to USDA to lead that, and to REE specifically. And so one day I got a call from Joe Glauber, our chief economist, and said, we'd like to have a meeting with you and the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy on behalf of GEO, and would REE pick up this responsibility. Why me? Partly it's just the structural, serve as the principal to GEO for USDA, and so organizationally it makes sense. But in addition, because of my background as an ecosystem ecologist, I'm very familiar with remote sensing applications on grand scale and landscape approaches. And so just from an intellectual perspective, it made sense. And then we were also very fortunate. We had on staff in the Office of the Chief Scientist that year, Dr. Deborah Peters from Agricultural Research Service, who is a landscape ecologist, is a systems ecologist, and loves working on remote sensing projects. So that just was like the perfect storm with my leadership because of the position I was in, her experience, and the interest in really going beyond the basic GeoGLAM. And I've now been appointed co-chair of the advisory committee for that, which I'll probably retain for another couple years, but it allows us to really coordinate across all of the countries that are involved in the GeoGLAM process. And the next question is, well, where to next with GeoGLAM? And it's partly to look at the non-commodity crops, non-global commodity crops, but to begin looking at regionally important crops, things like legumes and pulses or chickpeas and cassava and sorghum, things that maybe on a global commodity basis are not as important, but in a regionally or very regionally important, especially when it comes to food security.
You've been very active in a number of professional associations. Can you describe some of those and tell us why you believe those activities are important?
Well, probably my premier professional association is the Ecological Society of America, and not surprising as an ecologist, which is 100 years, by the way, last year. I joined that as a master's student, probably 1976 was my first year, and I've gone to pretty much every meeting except maybe a dozen or so over the years. And the importance of any of those professional societies is to meet your peers and to exchange ideas. Since I became a manager of research, it's less about exchanging the technical side and developing a cohort to understanding what are the emerging issues. And right now, that's really what I find the most useful when I go to those professional societies, because I don't usually have a function. I'm not necessarily speaking anymore, but I do have a cohort, people that I went through the graduate programs with and research activities. But it's really to see what's emerging as issues, what are the big next wave, if you will, to talk to students about opportunities in USDA and really a diverse portfolio. But that, I think, encompasses why professional society engagement is important for anybody who's into science, because you do have that peer-to-peer collaboration. You create new ideas, and if you're an academic or a researcher, you can be generating joint proposals together, and a lot of times the kernel of an idea starts at that professional meeting. More often than not, it's over a beer or a wine in some bar everywhere with all the students, and or in some kind of gathering. And it really does spark some very creative, new and emerging research areas. So that's, as I said, that's been my principal one. I've also been a member of the Society of American Foresters when I was in forest policy, which was very important at the time. Most recently, I've gotten involved with SACNAS, which is Society for the Advancement of Chicanos and Native Americans in Science. It is a mouthful, so SACNAS is much easier to say. And actually, the reason I got involved in that was, first, I only discovered them 4 years ago, and I can't believe in all my career in research and science that I never met this organization before. But I was invited to one of their Washington, D.C. leadership meetings and met many of the students and some of the faculty and realized how incredible these students are. These kids are really thinking about their future, but they also have leadership skills, they have communication skills. And I really asked the organizer, so where have you been all my life? And they said, well, we need you to know, because they have a very strong NIH and DoD connection. And they said that our students are increasingly asking about agriculture, natural resource, food technology, water conservation, because more often than not, that's the land they're living in, if you're Native American, or that's the issues their community is concerned about, and they would like to know more about you. And so I've gotten very involved in SACNAS, became a lifetime member just because I felt it was an important thing to do. And the USDA has gotten involved. We've been at the last 2 annual meetings in a fairly low, a small footprint, if you will. But this year, we are once again going in as a gold sponsor. We're going to have a much more significant footprint at the meeting, including having special presentation times, a couple panels, a recruiting booth. But we've really gotten a whole of USDA interest in it as a society. And it's partly about recruiting, but it's also about engaging a really different community.
Part of your legacy is that you have shown a real dedication to underserved communities. Can you talk about some others and the importance of that work?
Somebody once asked me recently, how did you get interested in dealing with underserved communities and environmental justice matters? And, I honestly can't point to why I did, except maybe an accumulation of events. I think partly, if you're dealing with ecosystems and you start dealing with managed ecosystems, which I was, I did a lot of work on reclaimed strip mines, started getting into urban areas for science, people become really important. And if you're in urban research and urban ecosystems, the underserved population becomes the most important one, because they are the ones who are struggling with access to water, access to benefits. You don't have green spaces as much in the poor neighborhoods of cities as you do in the rich neighborhoods, and this is a truism in the past, but increasingly we've been changing that. So I think it's just, I got socialized maybe about the importance of environmental justice matters. I had, as a Forest Service research leader, I actually had a couple scientists who mentored me in the importance of this. One of my favorite research groups is actually the Baltimore Ecosystem Study, where they started out as a traditional watershed study, and they've now overlaid a social science component. So they're looking at how reconfiguring green spaces in Baltimore City in the poorest neighborhoods is actually changing the social dynamics, the community spirit, the recognition of nature, and some really interesting social questions. So I think it's just, again, I think it's an evolution of ecology, and as you're involved in ecosystem ecology and you start bringing people into it, you have to be bringing these communities into it. And then I think the other side is the Native American issues, was because of my work in the Forest Service and forest management, where so many of the areas where we had national forests, which are under USDA, and we were trying to manage them, were contiguous with tribal lands. And the differences in the management of those two lands, the opportunities to do better collaboration, we were really way behind on doing a good job of that. And I have to say, it's improved remarkably in the last decade or so. But I think that also increased my sensitivity that we really needed to recognize local community needs in some of these management activities.
So are there any other issues, projects, programs, or people that you'd like to describe, or any other contributions you'd like to make to this documentation?
I was reflecting on some aspects of my career and some of the major challenges, if you will, or seminal events. Maybe that's a better way to describe it. And one of the things that, as I look back on my Forest Service career, is I was one of the few ecologists in leadership at the Forest Service. And so that resulted in me getting a series of jobs that sort of capitalized on that skill. The first one was Director of Ecosystem Management in the very first year that it was created. And the whole idea behind ecosystem management at the Forest Service at the time was to really start pushing the agency to think about its lands in an integrated ecosystem way. So you basically went from full stop traditional uses to full ahead ecosystem management with no guidance, not much scientific basis, but with a great deal of interest in doing that. And that was a incredible, I was only in that job for a year, and then I ended up moving on to something else over at Department of Interior. But that year, we really were trying to build the basis for community, for collaboration, for getting the public involved, and there were so many different connections that had to be made. Interestingly enough, every other federal land management agency in the same year adopted ecosystem management. And there was a group of us who were like, okay, how do we do this now? And we all came together and actually became a very collegial group. And curiously enough, we were all women. And I think it's partly because all of us came out of the ecology background, had a different way of looking at things, and for some reason, that's who were in those positions were women. So it was a really interesting year of coordination and collaboration, and it was a peer group that really, I think, served us well as we went into the future. So that was one interesting challenge. One of the I thought of something. Oh, sorry, I thought of something that I wanted to say about what I didn't expect, and now, sort of going backwards. But my career trajectory, actually, I wanted to mention on what I did not expect, and when I look back on what I thought I was going to be doing and what I am doing now. It's a series of accidents and opportunities, but perhaps the biggest change that I did not expect was when I finished my Ph.D. and I actually moved to North Carolina to be with my to-be future husband. It was the same time. I was almost scheduled to get a job with the Forest Service as a researcher in soil science. It was perfect. And Reagan pink slipped, 25% of the federal workforce. So I came down there, no job, no opportunity for a job, and I spent an incredibly horrible year in a clinical testing laboratory testing blood and urine samples. Now, here I am, an ecosystem ecologist, doing that. It capitalized on my geochemistry skills, but still was really different. But then there was an opportunity after 11 months of hardly able to take it anymore. A friend of mine was offered a position that she didn't want to take because she was moving, but suggested I look into it. And it was what started my career, which was to become a research leader under the National Acid Precipitation Assessment Program, Acid Rain Program. I worked with and funded over 500 scientists over a 5-year period, $36 million a year by the time we were finished, and really demonstrated to me that I was a good research leader, but that to work in that kind of environment where you have so many different people collaborating and you're all trying to get to a common purpose was one of those remarkable events. And I still run into a lot of people who worked in the NAPAP program because we're now a big cohort out there, and I run into them in Europe even. And we all reflect on that time as being very unique and very special, and that we were given a lot of authority to do research to address a policy outcome with not as many constraints as we have now found in the rest of our career. So that it was I wouldn't have expected that. I thought I was going one path, but I ended up in this one, and it's been wonderful ever since.
Anything else you want to share?
Yeah, I actually want to go back to being an REE because I think one of one of the things that I've really have come to value in being in this position as Deputy Undersecretary in REE is the importance of the team. And we have, with Dr. Wotecki as the Undersecretary and myself, the perfect balance, I think, of expertise and knowledge and background. And so we really cover, between the two of us, pretty much the full portfolio of science. But we've also built a group of other people within the staff, whether it be communications, our executive assistants, who, by the way, I'll be allowed to telework, and they do a great job. The chiefs of staff that we continue to have come in have created an incredible professional group who all work well together and like working with each other together. So we're small, but we're very effective. And I have to say, it's probably one of the best offices I've ever worked in. And to its credit, usually I get tired of a job at year 4. I'm at year 6 and I'm not tired yet. So I think it's a good indication that we have a great team.
I think it's obvious to those of you who are the outside part of your team.
Good. I hope so. We like working with each other. And that's all.
Any last minute thoughts?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, well, I thank you very much.
Okay, you're welcome.